Hey guys, it's Ash from Apta Sophia. Kristen and I were able to interview someone very special for this episode, C.R. Wiley. We got to chat with him about his book, The Household and the War for the Cosmos. And we wanted to make the most out of every minute we got to talk with him. So I thought I would pop in before the episode starts and tell you a little bit more about Chris Wiley. He is a Presbyterian minister, a husband, and a father here in Washington State, where Kristen and I live. He has authored several books, including The Purloined Boy, Man of the House, and The Household and the War for the Cosmos. You can find all of these at canonpress.com. He is a host of the Theology Podcast alongside Dr. Thomas Price and Dr. Glenn Sunshine. Honestly, the list of his accomplishments, current positions, contributions to various boards and publications is vast. Learn more at crwiley.com. And before we jump into the episode, I want to let you guys know we are doing a giveaway of 2 copies of his book, The Household and the War for the Cosmos. Head over to our Facebook page and our Instagram and see how you can enter. And without further ado, we hope you enjoy.
This is Kristen Hedgecock.
And I'm Ash Matson. You're listening to Apta Sophia,
Which means useful wisdom in the pursuit of biblical womanhood.
Welcome to Apta Sophia. My name is Ash Matson, and I'm here with my co-host, Kristen Hedgecock.
Hello there.
And we have a very, very special guest today with us. We have C.R. Wiley live doing a podcast interview with us on his book, The Household and the War for the Cosmos. Hey, Chris.
Whoa. Hi.
Or Pastor Wiley. We go back and forth in email. We're not. Which do you prefer?
We're like, do we call you Reverend Wiley? Do we call you Pastor Chris or Pastor Wiley or Chris or?
Well, for the show, just call me Chris.
All right, Chris. We can do that. So, can you tell us just a little bit about how your book came to be? What motivated it? What was your aim in writing it?
Sure. Well, there are a couple of stories, I guess. One story is the occasion for the book. I actually delivered a talk at a conference in Chicago, and the talk went over really well. And about a year later, Canon Press approached me and asked me to write a book for them, kind of a sequel to another book I wrote. And I proposed to them that the talk, that I could turn it into a book, a very short book. And so the foreword and the preface are by Nancy Piercy and by Tony Esselin. And they were both at the conference. And I knew that they really liked what I had talked about. And I was pretty confident that they would want to support the book and write something in connection to it. So that's kind of the near-term reason for writing it. How it came to be written, but the deeper story has to do with a couple things. One is I come from a broken home, but that's not news. Lots of people do these days. But because I was from a home where there was just very little in terms of useful examples and sort of modeling to help me think about family life and households, I approached it in terms of my studies in philosophy and theology to try to understand what households are and how families live in them and so forth. So that was kind of the other part of it. And then I also was, and still am, quite distressed at some of the, I think, sort of unwise appropriation of certain cultural trends that into the church and the ways we think about family life and even about the Bible, that I think that are due to a number of factors. But kind of the long and short of it is we have a lot of leaders in the church who don't know how to think well about households or families. And for those reasons, there are certain things that are being, sort of incorporated into church life that are actually quite harmful to households and families. So I wanted to address what I thought were some root issues or root causes, and to try to point people back to things that were healthy and biblical. So anyway, that's kind of the story behind it all.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, Kristen and I both have really appreciated your book, and we're so excited to share it with our listeners. I came to faith later in life, and didn't really have a solid understanding of what the household was for, what God's intention was for it, or even what piety meant. That was such a huge thing for me in reading through your book. And I think just in our over emotionally driven, like feelings driven culture, especially when it comes to women and the way that they're taught to or led to engage with the Lord, just this whole concept of piety, I think could be really helpful for them. So before we dive into that, can you define what you mean by household in your book?
Yeah, a household, and this may sound pretty weird to people today, but a household is not another word for family. They overlap. There's some overlap between the two terms, but a household is an institution. But human beings live in institutions, and that's really where they have their relationships, is within institutions. So, for example, you could say the English language is an institution, if you get what I'm saying, because with English, we can communicate with each other. We can have a relationship because we have a shared language that has been instituted and handed down to us over time. So if we didn't have that language, we spoke different languages, we wouldn't have a relationship, or it would be very difficult anyway to have a good relationship. So institutions are things that we live in. So the law, for example, our civil laws are instituted. We have, Calvin's The Institutes of the Christian Religion. That was a book he wrote. He was talking about things that have been established that provided a structure for within which people could understand what God has done for us and so forth. But when we think about a household really is kind of like a structure. So like when you think about a building, like a house, you've got a physical structure that shelters you. But a household, you could say, is a kind of cultural structure that shelters you. Or you could describe it as a spiritual structure that shelters you, or an authority structure that shelters you. Because we live in a world where you can be hurt by lots of things. And if you have a shelter, then in that shelter, you can enjoy not only safety, but you can also enjoy, all the things that come with being with other people in the shelter, in the sense of having relationships and hopefully, relationships that are characterized by love and fairness and those kinds of things. So it's a structure. So now what goes into the structure, can be described in different ways. So for example, rules or roles, or you can also even think about things like economic, sort of practices or property. All these things make our households possible. So let's say if you didn't have any income, you'd have a hard time living, right? you wouldn't be able to have a structure within which you could have fellowship with other people in the household. So the household provides this framework within which families can live and thrive.
Great. Yeah. So, what are the primary functions of the household biblically, and how have they been outsourced? And what is this effect on the household with all this outsourcing that we're doing?
Right. Yeah. What's happened over the last couple of 100 years is what you just noted, Kristen, is there's an outsourcing. And the reason that that's occurred is because of something that happened that was absolutely, sort of revolutionary. In fact, we call it a revolution, the Industrial Revolution, in which a whole different approach to making things and being productive developed. So there are a lot of things that have come out of the Industrial Revolution that are good, but there are also some things that are kind of unintended consequences. So the good things, obviously, is when you get a lot of people working like insects, they can be as productive as insects. When you think about bees or ants, you could be astounded at the things that they can accomplish. Well, when human beings behave like bees and ants, they can accomplish great things. They can build big bridges. They can come up with antibiotics. They can send people into outer space. They can do all these amazing things. But before the Industrial Revolution, households were the primary sort of location, was the primary location. A household was the primary location where people did productive work. So like husbands and wives for thousands of years worked alongside each other together on this, and they owned things in common. So that's when, when the Bible talks about one flesh, it's talking about not only conjugal relations between a husband and wife, it's also talking about children, but it's also talking about their shared wealth, their shared home, their shared future, all the things that they have in common. So households are these marvelous institutions that are sort of able to bring together the sexes, men and women, the generations, children and parents, grandparents, and so forth, and hold it all together. But what happened in the Industrial Revolution is people discovered that, hey, if we break up households and we take a lot of people and we put them into factories, they can produce, just amazingly, they can produce things that can't be produced in houses, like steel for buildings and things like that. So the Industrial Revolution obviously has this upside in terms of productivity, but the downside is that it separates people, it separates husbands and wives, it separates parents and children, it separates work from recreation and daily life. So like in a typical household in the ancient world, you didn't go to work, on the other side of town. Work was out behind the house or in the shop. And so a father, for example, was always just a call away for his children. Hey, Dad. He would be out in the barn, or he'd be out in the field or whatever. Same thing with women. Women didn't feel like they were left out of the economy because the economy was at home.
Right.
So they were working with their husbands and everything. So, very often in the ancient world, in the pre-modern world, let's say, the household was, produced shoes. So it was a cobbler. So oftentimes the children were actually helping in the process. The wife would perhaps be the person who went out and made sure that, all the bills were being collected. In other words, the payments were coming in. We're doing maybe the bookkeeping, maybe making sure that the orders for the raw materials were being sent out. Maybe the father was spending his time actually working on the physical shoes and trying to get them, ready for the customers. So everybody was working together. Nobody felt left out. But when you had the Industrial Revolution, initially everybody went into the factories. That's why we had child labor, because children were always working alongside their parents. So daughters were working alongside their mothers, and sons were working alongside their fathers. So girls went into the factories where the big looms were and machines and stuff like that. And there were all sorts of terrible things that happened, accidents and stuff like that. And then little boys would go with their fathers into the mines, and they were used in the mines to get into little nooks and crannies that the men couldn't get into. And you see these pictures of these little boys with faces covered with soot, stuff like that. But that was kind of like normal life, because, on the farm or in the shop, the children were helping. And so it just was like natural. Oh, I have to go to work. So mom would just take her daughters with them, with her into the work. Fathers would take sons with them into the work, where they worked. And then, of course, we all kind of realized this is crazy. And so we decided to send the mothers and the children back home, but the fathers never went home. The fathers continued to stay outside. Now, initially, that was sort of like seen as like a really positive thing. But eventually women, for obviously good reasons, began to feel left out. They said, well, wow, all the exciting stuff is happening over there. And I'm stuck here, kind of having to take care of stuff that no one thinks is important anymore.
Right.
And so then they felt like, well, if I want to have a good sense of who I am, I need to be over there working with, the men in the factory or in the whatever. So, So all of this, of course, leads to all kinds of unintended consequences. Elderly people being, alone, children being sent off to schools and things like that. So that's kind of the story, that how it all kind of came to be the way it is.
Oh man. All right.
That's a great history lesson.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Learning so much. We're both over here like frantically taking notes as you're talking.
Right.
But so within this hierarchy within the family that God intends to be there in order to accomplish the tasks that he's given us. What are the primary duties that are given to the members of the household, and how have these roles changed now that they've been stripped of this original purpose and everything has been outsourced? I think in your book, you said that the home kind of becomes this place of like leisure where you're just there to rest instead of to produce. So what does that look like in those different roles?
Yeah, well, it was a very commonsensical way of kind of thinking and living for our ancestors. So, because people believed in God, and because people believed that God gave us bodies that have purposes, there were very sort of commonsensical ways of thinking about them. So obviously women bear children. Now I know that's controversial today, but
you wouldn't think it would be, but it is.
Yeah, that's right. But for thousands of years, it was like, of course, what else could we say about this? So we need women to do the work of bearing children. That's why we call it labor. So she's gone into labor. That's her work. she's laboring to produce a baby. And if we don't have babies, we're in trouble, deep trouble, for many reasons. So women historically were honored for that work because there was nobody else who could do it. And that's one of the reasons, like when we look at the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, we see these women who are childless, just despondent. They feel like, I have no purpose. I'm not contributing to the community. God help me bear a child. Now, today we tend to think of that exclusively in sort of emotional terms. That was always the case, I'm sure. But there was also a social dimension to this. So today, when a woman has more than 2 children, she's kind of looked at funny. But in the ancient world, it was like the more children a woman could bear, the more her status went up.
Right.
So that was why you had, competitions between women to see how many babies they could produce. It wasn't because they were slaves. It was because this is the way that women really are indispensable. There's no one else who can do this work. Women are the ones that do this work. So like in the founding of Rome, this is kind of a fun story, Romulus and Remus and all that kind of stuff. So essentially Rome was founded by a bunch of outlaws. So there's this outlaw band of men, and they found the city, and they look around and they say, we don't have any women. We're in trouble. We're going to die. We need women or our city is not going to go anywhere. So they go out and they start stealing women.
That's how you do it. That's how you solve that problem.
That's right. At least for them. But this was so much sort of kind of woven into the way people kind of just understood the way things work. So, when it came to men, there were things, because there were no sort of labor saving devices, there were no, backhoes, there were no, circular saws. There was a lot of physical labor that went into economic activity outside the house. So, outside the physical house. So like you're out, plowing or reaping or whatever, physical strength, was a hugely important advantage. Today, it's not so much the case because we can always just buy a machine to do things. But in those days, it was just obvious. Okay, we need men to do these things. We need women to do these things. If the women don't do those things, we're dead. If the men don't do those things, we're dead. So we got to work together. And so the men and women looked at each other as being absolutely necessary to each other. They needed each other. And so that was what informed the work. And so, but the thing is they shared the wealth in common. So but one of the things that was really sort of hard, it was really central, but kind of hard for people to relate to today, is that prior to, this is like 200 years ago, there were no state troopers. There were no policemen. There were no standing armies. In other words, all of those sort of martial and law enforcement tasks would fall on the shoulders of the heads of house, the men. So men were, really encouraged to know how to use a weapon, know how to work together in a fight, those kinds of things to protect their households. So a man wouldn't just sit at home and send other people off to fight. He would actually go out and fight for his household. It's like if you see if you've ever seen Mel Gibson's film, The Patriot, well, that was the way it worked. A father was the one who went out and fought for his house. So there was, a strong stress on that aspect of masculine virtue. A man would need to know how to do certain things to protect his house. So he didn't send his wife out to fight. He didn't necessarily, he would take his sons out to fight if they were old enough, and he had trained them. But it was understood that that was just one of the tasks that men performed. And remember, this was a time when, hand-to-hand combat literally meant hand-to-hand combat. You didn't have, AR-15, or AK-47s or things like that. You actually physically, you would take a knife and stab a guy, that kind of stuff. So physical training, physical strength were tremendously important. But of course, the Industrial Revolution has changed warfare, obviously, in many ways. But that's the world that our ancestors lived in. And for them, many of the things that we think are kind of out of date, they thought of as being absolutely necessary.
Mm-hmm. Right. I can imagine why in our current culture, it would be easy for us to lose sight of a concept like piety and duty and loyalty and that sort of like bearing down and doing what's necessary. And we have such luxury now to do those things, like you said, and you don't fight for your own family. You send somebody else off to do it. It's like you don't even have to know what's happening or see it. It's just a number. It's just a story on the news. And for a man to be, how a father would relate to their duty to protect their family, how different that would be if you knew like you actually had to you could have to lay down your life at any moment if somebody threatens, instead of hiding in the back room and calling the police. Right. I don't know.
That's right. Yeah. There are many examples of this, even in our colonial history. So the town I lived in when we lived in New England is a place called Tolland, and it recently celebrated its 300th anniversary. But it was actually a breakaway from one of the oldest municipalities in North America, which is Windsor. And I think Windsor is like the 11th oldest town in North America. But anyway, when you go to the Tolland Town Hall, they have the list of the war dead, and it begins with the French and Indian Wars. And when you look at the list, the longest list is the French and Indian Wars. The list is longer than World War II or World War I or any of the modern, because the wars were actually being fought down the road 20 miles. Mm-hmm. And so what you had is men who were actually going to with the other heads of house in their town to fight the French and the Indians right down the street. That was the world that they lived in. And now, of course, there would be situations where women were caught up in the fighting for that reason. You can't, sometimes you lose. Sometimes there's a sneak attack. So there's a marvelous story called it's referred to as the Ballad of Jenny Wiley. So I'm a Wiley, so I know about it. And in Western Pennsylvania and West Virginia and Northeast Kentucky and Southeast Ohio, that part of the world is where my ancestors were from. And Jenny Wiley was a woman, I think she had 5 or 6 kids, and her husband had gone off to sell ginseng in the market, and she was home when there was an Indian raid. And so her, Jenny's brother-in-law said, there's Indians outside, came and warned her, you better do what you can to prepare for that. He had his own household to take care of course. Anyways, when the Indian raid came, she was abducted. All of her children were killed, and she was taken into captivity. She actually escaped and got away, and she ended up reuniting with her husband, and they had like 8 more kids. It's just, one of these stories.
Our eyebrows.
Yeah. So there's actually a park in Kentucky called the Jenny Wiley Park, and every year they have a play kind of honoring her memory. It's obviously a very politically incorrect thing because Indians are the bad guys,
Right?
And she gets away. But that was the world that our ancestors lived in, and so women were obviously tough, but they were of course not as strong as their husbands, and they were hampered by the fact that they were taking care of little children and older people too often, and their husbands maybe have gone to the market or something, and find themselves in this kind of situation. So it was a very dangerous world for our ancestors, and there was a kind of natural division of labor for them.
Yeah, the women would have had to be much more emotionally resilient than we are in this day. Can you imagine a woman from that time period seeing one of the screeching feminists outside the abortuary, like on their knees with their buzz cut? I just don't. Oh my goodness.
Well, yeah. When you think about the story of Jenny Wiley, in the story, she has an infant that she had just given birth to like weeks before, and she's running away with her baby. And they capture her and her baby, and then they end up killing her baby in front of her because the baby won't stop crying, and so
my word,
kill the baby.
Yeah, to get through a life like that, oh my word, it's just it's hard to fathom. And then to go on to find your husband, and then have 8 more kids.
Yeah, and to think, and from my perspective, the husband, I imagine when he got home, he was like, "What? I can't believe I left them, and they got this happened to them."
Wow. All right. Thanks for sharing that story.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. All right. So we wanted to dive into the concept of piety a little bit more, specifically in regards to feminine piety. So let's just start with defining it, and then comparing it to kind of what's taken its place as far as the way that we speak about God and the way that we approach religion.
Yeah. Piety comes from the Latin word pius, and there's a corresponding word in Greek that means essentially the same thing. And that word is eusebio. What it meant is respectful regard for your benefactors. Now, the one to whom we owe them, everything is God. So God deserves the highest regard, our full devotion and service. But there are other people. I mean, there are others, I should say, who also have been helpful to us. Our parents, for example, civil authorities who are in charge of sort of administering justice in the community. So there are other people, but where it really began in terms of your day-to-day life was at home. So piety was, something that you would owe your mother, your father. So like when, we're told in the 10 Commandments, honor your father and mother, that's piety. That's, so piety was a social virtue. Now, today, when we think about it, we think of it almost as entirely as an inner thing. I have my love for God, and I express my love through my devotional life, my reading of the Bible and prayer and things like that. And while that's certainly part of it, that's also, you could say, a social virtue, because you're actually addressing another in your prayers. You're not just talking to yourself. So piety is this sense of duty and reverence that's directed toward those who have been your benefactors. Now, it also paradoxically is something that gets directed toward your children, but in the same way. So there are a couple ways to think about this. There's there's a classic way of thinking about it that comes to us from the Aeneid, which is an epic poem written by Virgil about Aeneas, who was a man who survived the sack of Troy. So if you remember the story of the Trojan War, told in the Iliad, in that story, the Greeks have surrounded the city of Troy, and the Trojans defend the city, but eventually are overcome because of the conniving of Odysseus, and they build a wooden horse and hide some men in it. And anyway, you know the story. Mm-hmm. But when the city is being ransacked, being burned, and people are being killed in the streets, and the fighting is going from house to house, Aeneas is one of the Trojan heroes, and he was his nickname was the Pious One, Aeneas the Pious One. And what that said is that he was a man who did his duty. And so he goes home when he realizes that there's no way that they're going to survive, that the city is lost. He goes home to save his father, his wife, and his son. So that's what he does. He goes home, and what he does is he puts his father on his back, and he takes his son by the hand, and he's in his other hand he's got a sword because he's got to literally fight his way out of the city, and then his wife is following behind him. So as you can see, he's performing he's doing his duty to his father, to his son, and his wife. So he's like leading them out of the city. And the reason he has to carry his father is his father can't walk. He's a cripple at this point. So he's carrying his father. And the Romans believed that Aeneas was their father. So the Romans believed they were descended from the Trojans. So they believed that Aeneas was like the founding father of the Roman people. And so the story of the Aeneid tells the story of Aeneas and how he was so pious that he fought his way out of the city to save his father and his son and his wife. Now his wife is lost in the fighting. Unfortunately, she doesn't make it out. But that image of Aeneas carrying his father on his back was on Roman coins. And when you had those Roman coins, you'd see that image, and underneath it would be the word pius or pietas, which would say he's doing his duty. So a man did his duty by serving his father, serving his child, serving his wife in the way a man can do that. There were also coins with women that had pius. There's one famous one where there was a mother with her baby, and a mother taking care of her baby was pietas. She was doing her duty, taking care of her child. There's another one that shows a woman pouring out a libation. So in other words, she's actually in the temple, worshiping a god. And so that was also pietus, pius. So she's performing her duty to the gods. And when Christians and Jews thought about this, obviously there's only one true God. They would say, hey, we're just as pious as you guys, but we know the true God. In fact, we're more pious than you guys because we're actually worshiping someone who's real and not, stuff that's made up. So that's how it all kind of fits together. And so the Romans thought that piety, in this way of thinking, doing your duty, was the glue of society. When people stopped doing their duty, everything fell apart.
Yeah. This is like everyone in our culture is so focused on their individualism. And it's hard to, on every level in the church, even, we don't see ourselves as part of the corporate body in the way that we should, especially depending on what denomination you're a part of.
It's just my relationship between me and Jesus. What do you have to say about it?
Yeah. And then in your own family, like the separation, once you leave your parents' household, you're just your own little island. There's and relationships to parents, relationships to husbands, so much about the romance and the emotional element of it. Yeah, it's hearing about this is so hard to picture this type of society. It's so separated from what we experience and what we're in right now.
Yeah, and I think that's very true. The thing I've learned, though, is, as I've been talking about this subject for a few years now, is that it's almost as though we have these memories of the way it used to be, even though we haven't personally experienced it. Because as soon as I start describing these things, people go, "Of course, yes, of course, that's the way it had to work," and they kind of get it. And so I don't think of myself as someone who's introducing a new idea. I'm sort of a person that's digging up old ideas, old ways of doing things, helping explain why they're still good.
Right. It's so much more beautiful. It's so much richer and deeper than what we're all pursuing now, or what the culture is pursuing as individuals. Just to go on the other side of things, isn't it a bit unfair or unreasonable to expect a person to abandon individualism? What does this make of our lives? What type of paradigm shift is that between I got to make the most of the time I have and live for me, and living for something greater? Where do we find our fulfillment?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's a fair one to think about. I think that sometimes we put personal fulfillment and responsibilities on opposite ends of a line. So, like the closer you get to one, the further you get away from the other.
Hmm.
So it's like you have this either or, so to say. So either I choose to live for me, and then I'm happy, or I choose to live for my responsibilities and I'm miserable. But in actual point of fact, um, what I think is more the case is that when you uh, actually understand the meaning of your duties, then
Mhm.
your life is actually richer, and it's harder. I'm not saying that this is easy, but it's richer and more meaningful than when you live for yourself and your own pleasures. Um, and I think sometimes people learn too late. Unfortunately, that's the way it actually works. So you see this a lot. People who say, I'm going to, go out into the corporate world and pursue, my career or whatever, and I'm not going to think about these other matters. I'll get to them maybe someday, and then they discover that it's too late or things don't work out the way they had thought they would. Um, and then they find themselves, 50, 60 years old with no children, no spouse, and they're just kind of, what was it all for?
Hmm.
Yeah, I've got a nice big house, or maybe I've got a vacation in Malibu, but
Mhm.
in terms of uh, the significance of my life, my employer could fire me tomorrow and just replace me, or maybe I wouldn't even be replaced, and no one would remember me, long after that. Now, of course, when you have children and when you live in a household, you can have disappointments. Things don't work out the way maybe you would hope, so forth. But um, I think that all things considered, you're still investing yourself in things that have more uh, kind of meaning, both in the moment and in the long run. When you invest
Mhm.
yourself in, say, your children or your parents or your local community or your church, when you can actually see, okay, I've got gifts. God has given me gifts, and I'm exercising those gifts in the service of my family, whatever. And what you end up with is a greater sense of not only purpose, but a sense of kind of identity. Who you are. I do these things, and these things are helpful to other people, and because of that, I'm actually enriched by actually doing these things.
Mhm.
And like I said, it's not as though they're always easy or they're always uh, meaningful in the moment. You might feel like it's drudgery at any given time. I can't believe I'm having to do this again, that
Mhm.
kind of thing. But in the sort of the cumulative effect of it all can be very enriching. So anyway, those are some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's
Yeah.
good.
So now that we have all a little bit of a basis of what piety is, the importance of it, like how do we reclaim that? How do we recover that and by way of rightly ordering and working as a household?
Yeah, I think, Christian, that's the key. Working as a household, like if you can think about it that way, that takes you a long way toward achieving it. So when we think about the household as a productive institution, uh, there are different ways we can think about it as being productive. So if we think about it, uh, you could say that we've outsourced, not only in recent years, not only the economic sort of things that are for the market, like making shoes, but we've also outsourced the human resources side of it, like education,
Mhm.
elder
Mhm.
care, those kinds of things. So those were always considered tremendously important. So there's a marvelous book that was written in the fourth century BC by a fellow named Xenophon, and in that book he's describing household management, how it works, and in it it's actually a Socratic dialogue. Socrates is talking to a very successful head of house, and he's asking him, what's your secret? How do you do these? How come your household is so productive and well off? And one of the things he talks about is his relationship to his wife. And he says, one of the things that I said to her early on is that, our children, and again, they're assuming that they're going to have children, will be there for us in our old age. In other words, they didn't have Social Security. They didn't have 401ks. Your 401k was the kid.
Right. Or nursing homes or.
They didn't have any of that stuff. So, and then he says to his wife, he says, you may not feel today like you have much regard, as much regard as you like, but there may come a day when in our household, you are held in higher esteem than I am, because you have served our household so well that our children will honor you even more than they honor me. So this is one of those things that people don't tell you about. In the ancient world, it wasn't this sort of horrific world in which women never got any sort of positive regard or anything to show for all their work. In this particular account, and by the way, this was like a bestseller in the ancient world. Everybody knew about this book, and but in it, he's describing ways that his wife will work in sort of the productive capacity of the household. She's sort of like she's in charge of many servants. She's in charge of many activities in the household. She's responsible for all these different things, and her status in the household grows with her service. The more she serves the interests of the household, the more important she's seen to be, not only in her household, but even in the community. That's one of the messages of Proverbs 31 is that a woman in the ancient world would actually have a very significant social standing based on how prosperous her household was. So she was fully invested in making sure that her household was everything that she would like it to be.
Man, that was one of my favorite parts of your book, because I love how you were saying that somebody would read that and potentially see it as like this oppressive thing, that he's telling her to do all these things, but it ends up being, it's like a job description for the manager of a large company. Like we're just seeing it in a wrong way. And it's not oppressive if you actually have the right perspective. It is setting her up for all these wonderful things. Yeah,
you just look at Proverbs 31. What is she doing? She's buying, she's selling, she's directing servants, she's doing all these things to make sure her household is prosperous and prepared for whatever. So generally speaking, like if you read Aristotle's Politics, and in the Politics, what Aristotle does, he says that the foundational institution for a healthy city is a household. And then he describes the two things that need to happen in any given household. And generally speaking, Aristotle says one set of responsibilities is the wife's, and the other set of responsibilities is the husband's. And the wife's responsibilities had generally to do with things like bookkeeping, making sure that all the supplies were in place for the productive activities that they were engaged in. So she was basically in charge of kind of cash flow, kind of the cash flow operations of the household, and then directing the servants of a household, if it was a large household, in their work. Then the husband was generally responsible for representing the household in the larger community. And so he would be the spokesman for the household, say in, the courts or, in the deliberative bodies. That doesn't mean that even then women weren't doing things outside the household. They were often involved in religious activities, and supporting, temple worship and things like that. So there was a lot of stuff that we kind of miss today, because I think that we tend to read history through the lens of the modern world, and we kind of miss things because of that.
Right. So I didn't want to skip over defining cosmos, because your book is household and the war for the cosmos. So that's the thing we're fighting for. So how do you define that in your book, and how are we warring for it?
Right. Well, the cosmos today, when people hear that word today, they think outer space, right?
Right.
In the ancient world, the word cosmos meant order, and what it reflected is the order of at the biggest level. So a household is sort of like a microcosm, a mini order. And then the cosmos is God's order at the cosmic level of the household, the largest household of all. The largest household is God's household. So when we have the story of creation in the Bible, God is putting things in place. He says, okay, this goes here, this goes there. This is what this thing is supposed to do. This is what this thing is supposed to do. And then in our households, we have the same kind of thing. This is what you do. This is what I do. So there's an order. So the big order is reflected in the small order. So that's how they work together. Now, chaos, disorder, misrule is what is happening when there's sin, when there is rebellion, when there is a war against God's rule. When there's a war against God's rule, it's a war against God's order. Now, when things are well ordered, everybody thrives, everybody has a purpose, everybody is needed, everybody's working together. When you have disorder, when you have chaos, everybody is like pandemonium. Everybody's fighting each other, trying to get what they want, and if you win, I lose, and if I win, you lose, and that kind of thing. Instead of a harmony in which everybody is working together for the common good, and everybody is enriched in the process. You don't lose your individuality. In fact, your individual calling is reinforced and celebrated. So like when Paul says, if the foot says to the hand, I don't need you, that kind of thing is crazy. We all need each other, but you're a foot, I'm a hand, he's an eye, that kind of thing. So we all need each other, and we're all working together. So the war for the cosmos is that war. It's for God's order. And the marvelous thing that we have in the book of Ephesians is not just a picture of the world as it currently is, but we have a picture of the world as it will be. And that world that will be is the world that Christ has instituted through his saving work. And what that is a relationship between the groom and the bride, right? So the bride is the church, right? And the groom is Christ. And what we have at the end of the world is a wedding, right? So we have, Revelation, the New Jerusalem descends as a bride adorned for her husband, right? And everything that belongs to the husband becomes the wife's, and everything that belongs to the wife's is the husband's. So we still have that today, unless you have premarital or prenuptial agreement that says, which is a relatively new phenomenon. But, what we have is, let's say, so let me tell you a little story. So my grandmother was kind of a gold digger. I don't know if you're familiar with that. So I take it you are familiar with that term.
All right, I'm interested. What happens next?
Well, my grandmother actually looked a lot like Marilyn Monroe. So she was a really attractive woman. She was Miss Kansas City, so she was this kind of beauty queen kind of thing. So she won my grandfather. My grandfather was the vice president of Magnavox. So he was like the gold guy with the gold, right? Now I'm having a little fun here, but you could say that the church, because we're in sin, we're in deep debt, right? The church is in deep debt. We have, all the sins are counted against us. But Christ, because he is infinitely wealthy, he's righteous, he can take our sins upon himself and pay for them, right? And then give us everything as the church. So all of his wealth, all of his glory, all these things are ours as the church because of this marvelous marriage we're talking about here. So when Paul talks about one flesh, he says in Ephesians, he says this is a mystery. This is a profound mystery. He's starting off like he's just talking about, men and women and their lives and stuff like that. And then he says, oh, and by the way, it's kind of like, oh, and by the way, this is a mystery. And what he's getting at is this marvelous, sort of spiritual reality that the one flesh union of a man and woman points to. There's a spiritual reality that the relationship that men and women have that is fulfilled in the union of Christ and the church. So when we enter into the new, heaven and the new earth, when everything is made new, all the things that belong to Christ will be ours as believers, and it's we're joint heirs with Christ. All of his authority will be, we'll share in that. That's why we're going to be judges of angels. We're told that, and there are all these things that Paul says in the New Testament that are kind of offhanded, and like we should all know this stuff. Oh, and this. I'm like, no, I don't know that. It's like I never heard that before. I'm going to judge angels. That's crazy. But it's not because we deserve to do it. It's because Christ has paid for our sins, and we are united with him. And because of that, we are going to enjoy all of his riches. So I have a little fun with that story about my grandmother being the gold digger, mainly because I want to tell that story about Christ and the church, because the church doesn't earn its salvation. The church receives its salvation because of what's been done for it in Christ. So that's why I think that the household and in particular the union of a husband and wife is so important, because it tells the story of the end of the world.
Man, that's a great that's a great little quote right there. And you definitely redeemed calling your grandma a gold digger, because you made her a biblical analogy, in a positive way. She can't be mad at you about that.
Well, she was a tough gal. I've got other stories about her, but I remember when I was a young Christian, I was staying with her one time. She had this palatial house in San Francisco. My grandfather was gone at that time, and I remember saying to myself, "Oh, I got to witness to Grandma." And so, I'm kind of getting my nerve up to do that. And so she had made me breakfast, and we were sitting at the breakfast table together. And I said, I started talking to her about Jesus, and she just looked at me. And she said, "Young man," and I knew it was over at that point.
Oh man, I bet.
Anyway, it didn't really go the way I hoped it would.
That's not a promising introduction to the rest of the conversation.
Right.
Yeah. So one thing I'm sure you get asked all the time, so I don't want to be too obnoxious in asking, the practical implementation of this. If you don't have because that has to be such a huge thing to answer, beyond just asking that, what does this look like practically? Bringing all of these institutions back under the roof of the household and reclaiming this. Have you seen anyone, just reading your book, have you seen anyone manifest these ideas in their own way that was?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. In fact, I think that if we think about it, you could say that the homeschooling movement is a manifestation of this. That's right. Yeah. So homeschooling is a huge part of, I think, the recovery of the household. And that's been going on for a little while. So that's a very encouraging thing. I think also caring for elders, bringing. So what's happening in our society is because we are no longer able to sort of outsource certain things because these things have become so expensive, we're actually being forced to bring some things back home.
Right.
So bringing the children back home because we can no longer trust our public schools, that's been going on for a while. But now this whole matter of caring for the elderly because we can't afford nursing homes anymore is also bringing these things back home. In terms of economically, sort of like income, I see a lot of households reviving, sort of at least a mindset, people trying to think, okay, how can we do more and more of our, economic activity out of the house? So, in our household, I'm obviously working from the home a lot. My wife does too. My wife's a piano teacher. She has about 35 to 40 students at any given time. So she's got steady stream of people coming through the house for lessons and stuff like that. And because I'm a writer and an illustrator and stuff like that, I'm operating out of the house. But we also have real estate, that we own and family has worked on in the past. Now that our kids are grown and out of the house, they're not working on those things with us like they used to. But my second son, I should say, still is managing the properties for me. Because he's back where the properties are. So, we moved out here to Battleground, and the properties that we own are in Connecticut. So my second son is doing that. And then my oldest son works with me on the podcast that I do, the theology podcast. So he's the guy that does all of the technical stuff on that. And he gets paid for that. But he's an audio engineer who lives in Nashville. So I still work with my sons on a monthly, even weekly basis. Our daughter is in college right now, so she's busy with that. So that's what's going on in our house. But I get people, connecting with me every week, almost every day, from all around the world about this stuff. So I'm very encouraged by what I'm hearing and seeing, and some of the stuff is really very exciting to learn about. Some really successful things going on. People try and fail too. There's things that, you try and it don't work. They don't work out, but that doesn't mean it's the end of the story. You can try again and do something different.
Right. We were just talking last night, just about the fear that some Christians have in looking at the culture and the direction it's going, and seeing the way that secularism is just like consuming and poisoning everything, and kind of seeing this potential impending like persecution of Christians, and what a protection it would be to withdraw from a lot of these systems that we depend on, and to really have to be dependent, like independent, especially economically, and not have to worry about, am I going to lose my job because I stand for Christ? Am I going to lose my health insurance because I lose my job? Am I all of these trickle down that would keep us from doing the right thing or making moves that we could make in regards to starting new businesses and taking chances that we could fail on, because we're not in this like system that keeps us chasing the next paycheck and just barely making it,
Yeah, exactly. I see more and more people, arriving at that same conclusion. We need to take more control, over our livelihoods.
Yeah. So one thing that we forgot to do at the very beginning of the episode, which we do at the beginning of every episode, this is the first time we've done it, is we always ask a would you rather question.
Okay.
And so this is super important and very deep theologically. Would you rather spend the rest of your life talking like Darth Vader or talking like Yoda?
Oh, definitely Darth. Yeah, definitely Darth Vader.
Okay. And what would you have to have a rational explanation. That's another part of the game.
Well, I don't know. I guess I just can't take Yoda seriously. I know that Yoda is like kind of a powerful creature, but his syntax, is all kind of messed up, and I guess I don't know. I just find the whole idea of being a really tall guy in a big black suit more attractive, so.
See, I think that talking like Yoda would actually probably make you more mysterious and alluring to people. They would want to know what's going on in your brain, as compared to Darth Vader kind of has like this mouth breather thing going on, and you don't.
Yeah,
you don't want to be that person.
Yeah. No, I hadn't thought about that. That's kind of creepy. So I wouldn't want the mouth breather thing. But yeah.
Can you imagine everywhere you go to stand in line, somebody is always going to be creeped out by you looking over their shoulder, like.
Yeah, I wouldn't want that. Now, if it came down to that, I would go with the Yoda. Yeah.
All right. What about you, Kristen?
No, I'd have to go with Darth Vader. Yeah. I wouldn't want to talk like a 2-year-old.
He's Yoda is a poet. He thinks about the world differently. It's not 2. Okay.
He's dyslexic or whatever. Like he just
Careful now. Careful.
Hey, that's hard.
All right. So then the question we're going to be addressing on our next episode, and this comes from my friend Lavisa. It says, would you rather clap during a Paul Washer sermon or ask R.C. Sproul a stupid question in front of a large crowd?
Okay. Well, I don't know the first guy. So is it Paul Washer? You said his name is?
Oh, normally we answer this on the next one, but I do want to hear your answer.
Oh, okay.
I would be blessed by it. So please tell us. And then we're going to break all the rules this time.
Well, I guess I'd prefer to. I'm assuming that the Paul Washer guy is maybe not a sound teacher. I don't know.
You don't know Paul Washer?
I don't.
He's gonna make you doubt your salvation in the best way. If you listen to a Paul Washer sermon and you are not crying by the end of the sermon, you are probably not regenerate. You should. Well, I'll send you a link. Okay.
I take your word for it. I'll take your word for it.
All right. I'm going to send you a link. R.C. Sproul, you would be okay being...
Yeah. I mean, if I asked him a stupid question, at least I would get a good answer. So I guess, it would be so unless he just sort of dismissed me as that's a stupid question and just let's move on.
Yeah. He might say, what's wrong with you people?
That's right.
I think that's the fear.
Yeah. I was actually in the room when he said that.
Were you?
Yeah. That's right.
What did it feel like?
Well, he was more or less saying it rhetorically, so he wasn't necessarily saying it to everybody around him. But at the time, it was kind of there was a vote on something at the General Assembly for the PCA, and he was trying to make a very strong point about what he thought needed to be done. So we all took it within in that way. But when you just take it out of context and say, what is wrong with you people? It's a great line. What is wrong with you people?
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah.
Well,
in fact, right next to him was D. James Kennedy. And I was maybe 10 rows in front of them.
Awesome. Babe, can you come say hi real quick? Sorry, this is our resident audio engineer, my husband, Ryan.
Hey, Ryan. Good to see you.
He says, hey, Ryan, good to see you. Sorry, he can't hear. He actually went to school for audio production, and he's like setting all this up and also keeping my 4 children in bed. So I appreciate it.
Gotcha.
Good job. Thanks, babe. All right. Well, thank you so much for giving us your time. I am going to go back and listen to this at least 7 times because you said so many good things.
I barely talk because I'm just like,
this
history.
She's got like
philosophy.
4 pages of
I have
notes
like 4 pages of notes.
It's so good.
Yeah, I'm glad. Thank you.
All right.
Love it.
Kristen, you want to take us out?
Yeah, absolutely. So go love your God, go love your husband, go love your kids.